Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we dive into the harrowing story behind a World War I gas mask, a souvenir doll from a young lady who performed in a Second World War musical review, and a British military jacket. Andrew looks at one of the earliest gas masks issued to Canadian troops during the First World War.
The psychology aspect of the mask, I mean, that's almost as bad as the actual gas. When you think about the sense of isolation that one would feel, it must have been horrible for soldiers.
Gary looks at a doll brought home as a souvenir by a performer in the army show during World War II.
The fact that they could do such a high-grade show that entertained both soldiers and civilians, I think is wonderful.
Andrew looks at a jacket once owned by a British soldier prior to the First World War.
Unfortunately, they often had to fight for benefits. You can still see that today in today's military. You would think that when someone gave so much for the country that it would be an automatic.
I'm Joanne Peppers. I'm the manager curator at the Dartmouth Heritage Museum in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. The gas mask that I brought in today was donated to the Dartmouth Heritage Museum in 1967 by Mr. Cyril Johnson. And the only notation that we had about it was that it was one of the first gas masks used in World War I.
Previously fought on relatively contained scales and contested between professionally trained soldiers, in 1914, a new war would call upon civilian volunteers with no previous military experience to take up arms, and would expose them to unprecedented horrors. Many new methods of warfare debuted during World War I. On April 22, 1915, the Germans released 160 tons of chlorine gas over Ypres, Belgium, and onto French and Algerian soldiers. The deadly attack was repeated 2 days later, with Allied troops as the target. The Allies developed multiple versions of protective gear, but under the threat of chemical violence, total protection was never achieved. With almost 30 million gas masks circulated before the war's end, chemical attacks would still account for an estimated 100,000 deaths and unspeakable suffering.
Joanne, welcome to Militaria today.
Thank you.
And what can you tell us about your artifact?
I have brought in a gas mask today. It was one of the first gas masks used in World War I.
This is an iconic piece of First World War history. When I look at something like this, it kind of sends shivers down my spine. For me, that artifact totally embodies the horror of the First World War, the suffering that would be involved in someone that was exposed to gas. I think it was something like 12,000 Canadians were victims of gas attacks. You have here basically a very rudimentary gas mask. It's missing just a little piece that's right here. Basically, you would just put it over your head and you would try and tuck it into your uniform in the hopes that you would be safe from the chlorine or phosgene gas. Of course, it didn't always work because it could become untucked. There were still lots of casualties as a result. It was a better protection than nothing, but not much better.
What strikes me is the eyes. Your vision must have been almost nothing.
Very limited, and also the sense of isolation that must have come over a lot of soldiers. So the psychology aspect of the mask, that's almost as bad as the actual gas. When you think about the sense of isolation that one would feel, having to wear that for hours on end without having serious contact with your colleagues, it must have been horrible for soldiers. I can only imagine what they must have felt. It must have been horrible, and that to me would be the most dreaded aspect of the First World War. What kind of information do you have about the previous owner or the original owner of this artifact? Do you have any documentation?
So I looked a little bit more into Cyril Johnson's family. I'm wondering, did Cyril own the mask? Was it from someone he knew, or did he simply find this and think it was interesting for the museum? What I found out was that Cyril had a brother named James, and James served in World War I. So I went to a history book that we have called In the Wake of the Alderney by Harry Chapman, just on the off chance that he might be mentioned in the book, and he was. What Harry Chapman captured was a letter that James wrote home while he was serving in World War I. Our major was the very last man to leave the trench, and as we passed him, he told everyone to keep low and run for it. How I got through, I don't know. 2 bullets went through my pack I was carrying, and later I was struck in the side. The iron entrenching tool I was carrying saved me. The bullet glanced off, denting the tool and stunning me a bit. James was killed in action. So the brother was about 5 years younger, the brother named Cyril, who donated this mask to the museum. After the death of his brother, he still signed up to participate, which really struck me on the human side of things.
Cyril came back and he was able to live a relatively normal life as far as you can...
as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
Now, I don't have a whole lot of information about him, but the fact that he had this, he kept it, thought it was worthy to donate to a museum. I did see in James's will of sorts that his brother Cyril got the belongings from his kit, so that may have been how Cyril ended up with his brother's gas mask here. Seeing this gas mask kind of opened that door of finding out more about what life was like during World War I, and just learning more about the families who responded to that call to go to war and what it was like for them.
Do you know much about the history of gas warfare?
Not really.
The beginnings of gas in the First World War actually started in 1914. The French were the first to use gas. It was a non-lethal gas. It was like a tear gas. The Second Battle of Ypres, 1915, April of 1915, was the first appearance of chlorine gas. What chlorine gas does is whenever it comes into contact with something that's liquid, it turns into like an acid and does horrible things to eyes and lungs. So the Germans were the first to use the lethal gas, and it was against the Canadians and Commonwealth troops of the Second Battle of Ypres. After that, they switched to phosgene, which basically would fill the lungs with liquid, and you would almost drown in liquid. And then towards the end of the war, about 1917, they switched to mustard gas. Mustard gas was probably the worst of it because even if you had a mask on, it would burn you, it would cause blisters throughout the skin. This is a pH helmet, so this is going to be the second pattern of gas mask that was used. The hypo helmet was the first, and then about late 16, 17, they came out with a small box respirator. So that's a bit of the evolution of gas and protection of it during the First World War. In 1925, there was the Geneva Collective that stipulated that these countries would no longer use gas, and all signatories to that refrained from using gas because it was such a horrible, horrible weapon to use. And indeed, it was not used during the Second World War. Joanne, thanks for bringing in this iconic piece of First World War history. What does the future hold for this artifact?
Well, currently this is part of our museum collection. It has actually led to a lot of questions about World War I, so it's kind of opened up a research avenue for us.
Well, I think that's great. I mean, I think when people see this, they may not necessarily recognize it right away for what it is. And if it starts to open up questions about the First World War, I think that's fantastic, yeah. I think it could almost make a display on its own and could really speak to the horrors of the First World War.
I really enjoyed my time with Andrew today. He shed a light on a side of history that I don't actually know a whole lot about, especially the use of gas as a weapon. So I definitely learned a lot more about the gas mask and a little bit about the history of warfare.
Coming up on Militaria.
The fact that they could do such a high-grade show that entertained both soldiers and civilians, I think is wonderful.
My name is Shara Kingston. I'm the collections manager for the Army Museum. Today I brought in a souvenir doll, as well as a program of the Army show, Second World War. And these items were donated from the niece of Jean Gallant. And Jean Gallant was a dancer with the Army show.
Sanctioned by the Department of National Defence and broadcast by the CBC, the Canadian Army radio show debuted in December of 1942 in the throes of the Second World War. Predominantly written by Johnny Wayne and Frank Schuster, the series featured the comedy duo alongside musical guests. The show's keen reception led to its stage adaptation, which opened in Toronto in 1943. It was a highly produced collaboration of skits, choreography, and song aimed to entertain troops, boost recruitment, and relieve feelings of disconnect and despair on the home front. The show was extremely valuable in terms of its content and purpose. Inevitably, it would expand and join the Canadian Auxiliary Services Entertainment Unit overseas, where over 20 troops remained on active duty performing the Army Show until 1947.
So Cheryl, what did you bring in from the Army Museum today?
I brought in a souvenir doll from Holland. We do get souvenirs from soldiers. They often bring back maybe badges that they traded with other soldiers from other regiments, shrapnel that they've picked up on the field. And so this is different because her war was a bit more light.
More like something that someone that was visiting Holland may buy today to bring home as a souvenir of their visit there.
And I like this story in the respect that a lot of Canadian Women's Army Corps, some jumped into service because they wanted to serve and they wanted to kind of do their part, but a lot of them were looking for adventure because at that time, there were only so many things that young ladies could do. From her information from her niece, she actually for a long time worked at Woolworths and was a counter gal. Then she auditioned specifically to be in the Army Show, and they had to then enroll her with the Canadian Women's Army Corps. So she actually never got to participate as a soldier per se with the Canadian Women's Army Corps.
The entertainment industry affected World War II in multiple ways. You immediately sort of fall back to America and the propaganda effort in recruiting the actors that had gone off, then joined the military. A lot of them did, but then they'd pull them back. Same with the directors and that, and produce the propaganda films and such. England did it the same. Canada, not so much, because we really didn't have the same sort of film industry that the other nations did, but there still was the entertainment industry, which is why the radio show started. That was more up to speed for Canada. And then this touring show, which again was more reflective of what was going on in Canada.
It started as a radio show. It started with the beloved Canadians, Wayne and Schuster, doing the sketch comedy and coming up with the musical bits, as well as famous musicians that have moved on. And then they decided that they would tour it across Canada and perform for training centers, but also for civilians. And it wasn't until someone in the upper echelons saw how good it was, and they were thinking the original group that was doing the Army Show, the producers were gonna bring it to New York City, and they were just gonna do kind of a off-Broadway production of this show. But someone within the Army decided, no, this is too good, and we're gonna bring it overseas.
So it made it overseas, made it to England, and was that the end of it?
No, they kept going. What they ended up doing is they had the larger group, and then they decided that they would break them into 5 smaller groups so that they could go into hospitals and into smaller areas to entertain those troops.
And she was one of the ones, she was part of the, I believe it's called the B unit, that proceeded to Italy after the invasion of Italy to tour there and to put on the shows for the troops there.
They were.
This must have been quite eye-opening for a young lady from Nova Scotia that probably was lucky to get out of Halifax into the countryside, and here she is touring Canada, then overseas, then to Italy, then to Northwest Europe, and meeting all these people and seeing all these things that, you know, working the counter at Woolworths would not have brought.
Right, exactly.
So what I find interesting about the Canadian Army Show is that it had its roots really in the First World War with the Dumbbells, and the Dumbbells were the entertainment troupe from the 3rd Canadian Division. The similarity was they were soldiers. They were formed overseas from the soldiers in the division, the difference being they were all men. And they were quite popular, and they toured the Army and did their shows, and there was the singing and the dancing, much like Canadian Army show did. Then you fast forward to the Second World War, and now we have the advent of women being in the military, so now we can have women doing the female parts as opposed to men dressed as women. The thing I find interesting about this is that everyone's heard of the USO, the American Service Organization, but they had nothing to do with the military. They weren't military people. They were all volunteers. Their shows were put on by the civilians, whereas the Army show is totally military. The fact that they could do such a high-grade show that entertained both soldiers and civilians, I think is wonderful. So Shara, thank you so much for bringing these artifacts in. I was wondering if you can tell me what the future holds for them.
Well, this one actually just came out of an exhibit. We had an exhibit about souvenirs that soldiers bring back. When something goes out on exhibit, it has a lot of lights on it for a long time. It's been in a different kind of environment that maybe is warmer or what have you. We try and give it a rest period. So she'll go back into storage for a little bit. I always like to try and infiltrate the museum with women's stories. I'm sure something will come of her again and she'll be put back into another exhibit at some point.
Coming up on Militaria.
They often had to fight for benefits. You would think that when someone gave so much for the country that it would be an automatic.
My name is Blair Adall. I'm a dentist in Liverpool, Nova Scotia. I brought in a British military jacket, which was from my great-grandfather, who served in the British military and with the Canadian military in the First World War. I believe it's his uniform from early in his career, Redcoat, and a whistle that I think may have been part of his battle dress uniform when he actually was fighting with the Canadians in the First World War.
The iconic British Redcoat made its first official appearance on the battlefield during the 17th century. Many myths exist about why such bold colour was used, but the official reason lies with the English Civil War's New Model Army. Formed by parliamentarians in 1645, the choice was born out of a desire to standardise uniforms, and red dye was affordable and accessible. The decision would help inspire the institution of the Red Serge, worn by the RCMP. The traditional tunic has represented Canada's historical allegiance to Britain since 1873. The British traded in their scarlet jackets for muted khaki in 1848, when blending in became the difference between life and death. Today, they reserve their red uniforms for ceremonial occasions such as formal parades, where pride, not combat, is the focus.
Blair, welcome to Militaria. And you've brought a very interesting artifact for us today to have a look at. How did you acquire this?
It was in the possession of my grandfather. He'd had it from what I assumed since his father had passed away. He was killed in the First World War, and it sat in a closet for decades, as far as I know.
I personally love military uniforms, and I'm always interested in the fact that uniforms can really tell us what period we're dealing with by the cut of the uniform, the design, the materials used. And so it's almost like a little bit of detective work by looking at some of these uniforms. What we do have here, it's a pre-1914 scarlet uniform. If we look carefully at the cuffs, we can date this to the post-1907 period. If you look here at the chevrons, you have 4 here. This designates a rank of either regimental sergeant major or a quartermaster sergeant. It's I believe, a 7-button uniform. This is indeed a dress uniform. On the collars, we have some musketry insignia. And on the shoulder here, we have S.of.M., which is School of Musketry. So this is a post-1907 but pre-1914 uniform, so we can sort of place it in there. And it's in excellent condition. The quality is officer quality. It was probably a private purchase. He would have received a stipend to get it done up. I see you've brought in a whistle as well. The whistle actually doesn't go with this uniform. This probably would have been with his battle dress uniform. And what's significant about this is a lot of times going over the top. This is what NCOs or officers would use to get the troops to go over the top. It's not military marked. It looks to be a private purchase specimen, but that was not uncommon. So Blair, this uniform belonged to your great-grandfather, Thomas Radall.
Yes.
He started off with the British military and then ended up in the Canadian military. What can you tell us about his military career?
My understanding is that the British could see that there was going to be a war starting in Europe, and they sent soldiers to Canada to train Canadian troops to get ready for the First World War. And being a marksman, he was sent to Canada to train soldiers as fighters for the war effort from Canada, both as machine gun and, my understanding, as sharpshooters was his specialty. So that's how he ended up in Canada.
He enlisted in with the Canadian Expeditionary Force, but he was seconded to the Canadian military.
Yes, he was, from the British.
Okay. He would have been seconded to the Canadian military because at that time, the British were quite aware of what was coming. They had an idea that there could be possibly a conflict. They sent over qualified troops to train Canadian forces, as they did to Commonwealth countries, and he would have been there to basically get everyone up to snuff so that when the time came, we would be able to have the troops properly trained. Blair, you had also mentioned that he started very young in his military career.
Yes, he was 15 when he began with the British military as a drummer, and continued his career obviously through to become a career soldier. I believe he ended up spending time in both Hong Kong and Japan as a young soldier, and that he moved up the ranks as well as he did so when he finally became a Canadian soldier or fought with the Canadians.
And what can you tell us about his experience with the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War?
He ended up fighting with the Canadians at Vimy Ridge as well, and was wounded. I'm not sure he was wounded at Vimy Ridge, but he was certainly wounded at least twice. And because he was a career military man, decided that if there was a war going on, he was going to be in it, and therefore returned to the front each time after he had his wounds healed, and ended up being killed in August of 1918, just before the end of the war. He made it through till almost the end. He was killed in August of 1918, so all but 2 months of the war he was involved in. So I have a special bit of respect for the fact that being a career military man, and the fact that, you know, fighting in the First World War and returning to battle after being wounded. I have the ultimate respect that he gave the ultimate sacrifice for.
So Blair, thank you for bringing this artifact in. I do love it. It's a great uniform. What are your plans for this uniform?
That's a good question. I have inquired with other family members as to what we think we should do with it. Possibly see if the Museum for the School of Musketry in Hythe would be interested in it, or possibly the museum at home in Liverpool. The Queen's County Museum might be interested in having it, even though he was never a resident there. This might fit in with part of their collections as well.
Yeah, either way, I think that would be great. If someone was interested in the family, that would be great as well. I would encourage you to write all the information down that you have about this individual, just so it is saved and it keeps its historical context.
My time with Andrew was very informative. I learned quite a few things about the jacket that I didn't know, and the whistle as well. There was a few details that I found quite interesting, and yeah, it was very informative.